Teen dies and sees the afterlife's darkest truths, near-death experience. The final bell rang, and the hallway erupted into a flurry of activity. Ryan trudged through the throng of students, his mind weighed down by the mundane frustrations of a typical high school day. He was 16, caught in that in-between stage where childhood dreams felt out of reach and adult responsibilities loomed uncomfortably close. His grades were slipping, arguments with his parents were becoming more frequent, and an overwhelming sense of insignificance clouded his thoughts. He barely noticed the honking car as he crossed the street outside the school. The screech of tires and a sharp scream pierced the air, and then, nothing. Darkness enveloped him. When Ryan opened his eyes, he expected the sterile whiteness of a hospital room or the chaotic noise of an emergency scene. Instead, he found himself standing in an empty field. The ground beneath his feet wasn't grass or dirt, but a shimmering, mirror-like surface that reflected a distorted version of the sky above. The air was silent, too silent. It pressed on him, heavy and foreboding. "Where am I?" Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. "You are between," a deep, resonant voice replied. Ryan spun around to find himself face to face with a figure cloaked in shadows. Its form shifted constantly, as if it couldn't settle on a single shape. Despite the figure's obscurity, its presence radiated authority. "Between what?" Ryan asked, his chest tightening. "Between life and what comes after," the figure said. "You are not yet bound to one or the other. But you are here for a reason." Ryan's heart raced. "Am I dead?" "You are neither fully alive nor fully gone," the figure said. "Your journey continues, but first, you must see." The ground beneath Ryan rippled, and the shimmering surface turned translucent. He peered down, and what he saw made his stomach lurch. Below him stretched a vast, shadowy expanse filled with writhing forms. They were human-like but twisted, their faces contorted in pain. They clawed at one another, their cries muffled as though coming from underwater. "What is this?" Ryan asked, stepping back from the edge. "This is the reflection of choices," the figure said. "Each soul you see here is trapped not by an external force, but by the weight of their own deeds, their own intentions." Ryan's breathing quickened. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it is not separate from you," the figure said. "It is part of the fabric of existence, intertwined with the light and the dark. You must understand both to grasp the truth of your world." The scene shifted abruptly, and Ryan found himself in the middle of a bustling city. It looked like any ordinary urban landscape, but something was off. The people moved mechanically, their eyes hollow and their faces devoid of emotion. A faint, shadowy haze clung to them, swirling around their limbs like smoke. "What's wrong with them?" Ryan asked. "They are bound by their own indifference," the figure said. "This is the life they chose, one of disconnection, where the pursuit of power, greed, or self-interest outweighed their ability to love and connect." Ryan watched as a man brushed past a homeless woman on the sidewalk without so much as a glance. Her threadbare blanket barely covered her frail body, and her eyes were filled with quiet despair. The shadow around her thickened, while the man's grew larger, more oppressive. "Why doesn't anyone help her?" Ryan asked, his voice rising with frustration. "Because they do not see her," the figure said. "Or rather, they choose not to see. Their indifference feeds the shadows." Ryan clenched his fists. "That's not fair. It's not like she chose this." The figure turned to him, its gaze piercing. "No, she did not. But each shadow feeds another. The cycle of pain and neglect grows when no one intervenes." The scene dissolved, and Ryan found himself in a small, dimly lit room. A single candle flickered on a wooden table, its flame barely holding on against an unseen draft. At the table sat an old man, his hands clasped tightly in prayer. His face was lined with sorrow, but his eyes glimmered with determination. "This man," the figure said, "has faced great darkness in his life. Yet he has chosen to resist." Ryan stepped closer, watching as the man's faint, golden thread began to brighten. With every word of his prayer, the light around him grew stronger, pushing back the shadows that tried to encroach on him. "What is he praying for?" Ryan asked. "Not for himself," the figure replied, But for those he loves, for the strength to continue, for the chance to bring light where there is darkness, Ryan felt a pang of shame. He thought of the countless times he had dismissed his own struggles as insurmountable, using them as an excuse to turn inward and ignore the pain of others. This man, despite his burdens, chose differently. The ground beneath them shimmered, and Ryan was suddenly back in the empty field. The figure stood before him, its shadowy form now flickering with hints of light. "You have seen the shadows," the figure said. "You have seen their origin and their effect. But understanding is not enough." Ryan straightened, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling within him. "What do I do with what I've seen?" "You must choose," the figure said. "Every moment, every action, is a choice. To feed the light or to succumb to the shadows. Your life is a thread in a greater tapestry, and its strength depends on the choices you make." Ryan's mind raced as he thought about his life, the arguments with his parents, the times he had ignored friends in need, the moments when he had chosen silence over kindness. Each decision felt small at the time, but now he saw how they had shaped the person he was becoming. "Can I fix it?" Ryan asked, his voice breaking. "Can I change?" The figure's form began to brighten, its shadows receding. "Change is always possible," it said. "But it requires intention. The threads of light are never beyond repair." Ryan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what awaited him next, but he was determined to face it with open eyes and an open heart. The ground beneath him began to dissolve, the shimmering field giving way to darkness. Ryan felt himself falling, but this time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. Ryan felt the darkness dissolve as he landed gently in a new, unfamiliar place. The air was thick, almost heavy, and the landscape around him was a confusing blend of clarity and chaos. Shadows and light intertwined like threads in an infinite web, stretching in every direction. As he took a step forward, he noticed that each thread pulsed faintly, some glowing brightly, others barely visible. "What is this place?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the web of influence," the shadowed figure replied, its form still flickering between light and darkness. "It is the fabric of connection that binds all of existence. Every action, every thought, every choice sends ripples through it." Ryan squinted, his eyes following one of the threads as it wove through the air and disappeared into the distance. It glimmered faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed alive. He reached out to touch it, and the moment his fingers made contact, a wave of energy surged through him. Suddenly, Ryan was no longer standing in the strange web-like realm. Instead, he was in a small, cluttered apartment. A young woman sat at a desk, her head buried in her hands. Empty coffee cups and crumpled papers surrounded her. The golden thread Ryan had touched was connected to her, faint but present. She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping with the weight of unseen burdens. Ryan watched as the scene played out. The woman reached for her phone, scrolling through messages with a blank expression. A message from someone asking how she was doing popped up, but she ignored it, tossing the phone onto the desk. The thread dimmed slightly. "What's happening?" Ryan asked. "She is consumed by her own pain," the figure replied, appearing beside him. "Her choices reflect her isolation. She feels unseen, unvalued, and therefore turns inward." Ryan's chest tightened. "Can't someone help her?" "Can't I?" "You are helping," the figure said. "By seeing. Understanding is the first step. But help requires action, both hers and those around her." The woman suddenly paused, her gaze falling on a framed photo on her desk. It was of her and a friend, smiling brightly in a moment that seemed worlds away from her current reality. Her hand hesitated before reaching for her phone again. This time, she typed a message. "Hey, can we talk?" The thread pulsed faintly, growing slightly brighter. "She's trying," Ryan said, hope rising in his chest. "Every effort matters," the figure replied. "But the web is not strengthened by one thread alone. It requires many." The scene dissolved, and Ryan found himself back in the web-like realm. This time, the threads glowed more vividly, their pulsing rhythm drawing his attention to another point in the distance. He moved toward it, the figure following closely behind. As Ryan touched the next thread, Another vision unfolded. He was in a bustling office, the air thick with tension. A man in his mid-30s stood by a desk, his face tight with frustration as he argued with a colleague. Their raised voices echoed in the space, drawing the attention of others. "This man," the figure said, "has allowed anger and pride to guide his choices. Watch what happens." The man's thread, once golden, dimmed further as his anger escalated. His words became sharper, and the colleague he argued with recoiled, their own thread flickering weakly. The ripple effect spread quickly. Other workers began whispering, their threads dimming as fear and division took hold. Ryan clenched his fists. How can one argument cause so much damage? Because no choice exists in isolation, the figure said. The threads are interconnected. What affects one will inevitably affect others. Ryan turned back to the man, noticing something small but significant. His thread, though dim, wasn't severed. It still pulsed faintly, as if waiting for something to reignite it. What would fix this? Ryan asked. The figure gestured toward the man. An apology. A moment of humility. A choice to mend rather than divide. As if responding to Ryan's thoughts, the man paused mid-argument, his expression softening. He took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lose my temper." The colleague hesitated before nodding. Their thread brightened slightly, and the ripple effect began to reverse. The workers who had been whispering returned to their tasks, their threads regaining some of their light. "It's so simple," Ryan said, amazed. "Why don't more people do this?" "Because humility requires courage," the figure said. "And fear often disguises itself as pride or anger." The web shifted again, drawing Ryan toward another point. This time, he found himself in a suburban neighborhood. Children played in a park while parents watched from a distance. The golden threads here were stronger, their light weaving a network of connection that felt warm and alive. Ryan noticed a boy sitting alone on a bench, his thread dim but steady. He looked around, his expression anxious, as though waiting for someone. Moments later, another boy approached, holding a soccer ball. He extended it toward the boy on the bench and said something Ryan couldn't hear. The seated boy's face lit up, and his thread pulsed brightly as the two ran off to join the game. "It's so small," Ryan said, a smile tugging at his lips. "But it makes such a big difference." "The greatest changes often begin with the smallest actions," the figure said. "A word of kindness, an act of inclusion, these are the seeds of light." As the scene faded, Ryan stood once more in the web-like realm. He turned to the figure, his mind racing with questions. If the threads are so fragile, how does the web survive? How does it hold together with so much darkness threatening it? "Because the light is resilient," the figure said. "It is not easily extinguished. Even in the presence of great shadow, the smallest spark can ignite a flame." Ryan nodded, his heart swelling with both hope and responsibility. He thought of the woman in the apartment, the man in the office, the boys in the park. Each of them was part of this web, their actions influencing others in ways they couldn't see. And he was part of it too. "What happens next?" Ryan asked, his voice steady. "There is more to see," the figure said. "More to learn. But the truth is becoming clear, is it not?" Ryan looked out at the infinite web, its threads glowing and pulsing with life. He could feel its energy, its fragility, and its strength. "Yes," he said. "I think I'm starting to understand." The figure's form shimmered, its light growing stronger. "Then let us continue." The web began to dissolve, the threads fading into the distance as Ryan prepared to face the next truth. His journey was far from over, but his resolve was unshakable. The shimmering web of light faded away, and Ryan found himself standing in a dim, oppressive space. The air was heavy, thick with an invisible weight that pressed on his chest. Shadows writhed all around him, shifting and curling like living smoke. Their movements were chaotic, yet they seemed to follow an unspoken rhythm, a silent cadence of despair and regret. "Where are we now?" Ryan asked, his voice echoing in the void. "This is the realm of unchosen light," the shadowed figure said, its tone solemn. "Here resides the residue of decisions unmade, opportunities abandoned, and truths ignored. It is not a place of punishment, but of reflection. Ryan's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and he began to make out forms within the shadows. They were human-like but incomplete, their shapes fragmented as though pieces of them had been left behind elsewhere. Each figure seemed tethered to the ground by tendrils of darkness that pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat. "What are they?" Ryan asked, stepping closer. "They are echoes," the figure said. "Fragments of souls bound by their own indecision, their refusal to confront the light within themselves. They linger here, neither moving forward nor falling completely into shadow." As Ryan approached one of the figures, the tendrils around it recoiled slightly, revealing a young man slumped on the ground. His face was buried in his hands, and his body shook with silent sobs. A faint golden thread stretched from his chest into the distance, but it was thin and frayed, its light barely visible. "What happened to him?" Ryan asked. The figure gestured toward the thread. He chose inaction. Fear kept him from taking the steps needed to mend his connections, to strengthen his light. He knew what he needed to do, but he allowed doubt to bind him. Ryan knelt beside the young man, wanting desperately to help. "Can he still fix it?" he asked, turning to the figure. "He can," the figure said. "But he must choose to rise. He must face them himself." The scene shifted, and Ryan found himself in what appeared to be a courtroom. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting not just Ryan's image but fragments of memories, moments of hesitation, of avoidance, of fear. He saw himself sitting silently while a friend was bullied, walking past someone struggling to carry their groceries, ignoring a sibling's plea for help. "This is the court of reflection," the figure said. "Here, the shadows are not external, they are born of your own choices." Ryan's chest tightened as he stared at the mirrors. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you must understand the power of inaction," the figure replied. "The choices you avoid are as impactful as the ones you make. Every time you choose silence when a voice is needed, every time you turn away when presence is required, the shadows grow." Ryan turned to one of the mirrors, his reflection distorted by the swirling shadows around it. He saw himself sitting in his room, ignoring a message from a friend who had been struggling with depression. A week later, that friend had distanced themselves, and Ryan never reached out again. "I thought I didn't have the right words," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "I didn't want to make things worse." "And in doing nothing," the figure said, "you allowed the shadow to spread." Ryan clenched his fists, a mixture of regret and anger boiling within him. "But I didn't know it would matter so much." "Every moment matters," the figure said. "Even the smallest choices create ripples, shaping the web of light, or letting it fray." The courtroom faded, and Ryan was now standing in a vast cavern filled with towering pillars of light and shadow. Each pillar pulsed with energy, their brightness or dimness reflecting the choices tied to them. Some glowed brightly, illuminating the cavern, while others flickered weakly, their light overshadowed by darkness. "What are these?" Ryan asked, his gaze sweeping over the pillars. "They are the legacies of lives," the figure said. "Each pillar represents the culmination of a soul's impact on the web of existence. The brighter the pillar, the more light that soul has woven into the tapestry of creation. The dimmer it is, the more the shadows have crept in." Ryan approached one of the dimmer pillars, its light struggling to push through the shadows that clung to it. He placed a hand on its surface, and a flood of images filled his mind. He saw a woman who had spent her life chasing wealth and power, ignoring the people she hurt along the way. Her golden threads were frayed, her connections weak. "But she's not all bad," Ryan said, seeing flashes of her offering small acts of kindness. A meal shared, a moment of laughter with a stranger. "There's still light here." "There is light in everyone," the figure said. "But it must be nurtured, strengthened through intention and action. The shadows grow where the light is neglected." Ryan moved to another pillar, this one radiating with vibrant light. As he touched it, he saw scenes of love and selflessness. A man dedicating his life to helping others, building connections that glowed brightly and spread far beyond him. The light from his pillar reached the pillars around it, illuminating the cavern. "This is what happens when love guides a life," the figure said. "The light does not end with the soul. It spreads, weaving strength into the web." Ryan felt a surge of hope as he stepped back, his gaze shifting between the pillars. "So it's not about being perfect," he said. "It's about choosing love, even in small ways." "Exactly," the figure said. "Perfection is not required. Intention is." The cavern began to dissolve, and Ryan was once again standing in the dim space filled with writhing shadows. But now, he could see faint glimmers of light within the darkness, threads waiting to be rekindled, connections that could still be repaired. "These shadows," Ryan said, turning to the figure. "They're not permanent, are they?" "No," the figure said. "But they are persistent. They linger until a choice is made to confront them, to choose light over fear." Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. He thought of his own life, of the choices he had avoided, the moments when fear had held him back. He wasn't proud of those moments, but he understood now that they didn't define him. What mattered was what he chose moving forward. "What happens next?" Ryan asked, his voice steady. "There is more to see," the figure said. "But the path is becoming clearer, is it not?" Ryan took a deep breath, the shadows around him fading as he stepped forward. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The dimness around Ryan began to dissipate, replaced by a soft, golden glow. He stood on a narrow bridge suspended over a vast, sprawling tapestry. The tapestry seemed infinite, its intricate patterns shimmering with threads of gold, silver, and shadow. Each thread pulsed faintly, some glowing vibrantly while others were darkened or frayed. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, and Ryan felt a chill as he realized this was no ordinary artwork. "What is this?" Ryan asked, his voice filled with wonder and trepidation. "This is the tapestry of existence," the figure said, stepping beside him. "It is the living record of every connection, every choice, every ripple created by humanity." Ryan leaned over the edge of the bridge, his gaze tracing the intricate designs. The threads seemed alive, weaving and unweaving themselves in constant motion. He noticed areas of vibrant light where the threads formed harmonious patterns, and other areas where the darkness seemed to dominate, the threads tangled and torn. "Does everyone have their own section?" Ryan asked, his eyes scanning the expanse. "No," the figure replied. "There are no individual sections. Each thread is interconnected, woven into the lives of others. Every choice, every action, strengthens or weakens the whole." As Ryan stared into the tapestry, a section began to glow brighter, drawing his attention. He watched as the threads shifted to reveal a scene. A middle-aged woman was sitting on a park bench, handing a sandwich to a homeless man. Her golden thread pulsed brightly, sending ripples of light through the surrounding threads. The homeless man's thread, which had been dim and frayed, began to glow faintly, its connection to the tapestry strengthening. "That one act," Ryan said, marveling at the change. "It made such a difference." "Every act of love ripples outward," the figure said. "It touches not only the immediate recipient but also those around them, often in ways unseen." The scene shifted to show the homeless man later that day. Encouraged by the woman's kindness, he approached a shelter he had avoided for months. The light from his thread grew stronger as he stepped through the door, connecting with new threads inside. Ryan's chest swelled with hope. "So even small acts can have a huge impact?" "Yes," the figure said. "But the opposite is also true." The light in the tapestry dimmed, and another section unraveled, revealing a different scene. This time, a man sat alone in an office, his face etched with frustration. His thread was dark and frayed, connected weakly to others around him. Ryan watched as the man ignored a knock on his door, a colleague standing outside with a look of hesitation. The colleague turned and walked away, their thread dimming slightly. The man's thread, too, seemed to lose what little light it had. "Why does this happen?" Ryan asked, his heart sinking. "Why don't they connect?" "Fear," the figure said simply. "The man fears vulnerability, and the colleague fears rejection. Their inaction weakens their threads and allows the darkness to spread." Ryan's stomach turned as he watched the ripple effect. The colleague, feeling unseen, ignored another coworker's request for help later that day. That coworker, in turn, went home frustrated, snapping at their family. The shadows spread further, dimming the threads of all involved. So the darkness isn't always intentional, Ryan said. It's not always about malice, it's about what people don't do. Precisely, the figure said. The shadows thrive not only on harmful actions but also on the absence of love. Ryan turned his gaze back to the tapestry, searching for brighter sections. He spotted a vibrant area where a teacher was helping a struggling student after school. The student's thread brightened, and Ryan followed it as it wove into the lives of others. Years later, the student became a mentor, helping others in the same way. It's incredible, Ryan said, his voice filled with awe. One person's light can touch so many others. Light and darkness both spread, the figure said. The tapestry reflects the balance of these forces. But remember, the threads are not fixed, they can be mended. Ryan's attention shifted to an area where the threads were tangled and frayed. He saw a family sitting around a dinner table, their conversation strained. The father's thread flickered weakly as he scrolled through his phone, ignoring his children. The mother's thread dimmed as she tried to bridge the silence but received no response. They're all hurting, Ryan said, his chest tightening. But no one is reaching out. Their threads are still connected, the figure said. The light remains, but it needs action to strengthen it. Ryan watched as the mother sighed and stood, placing her phone on the table. She began to speak, sharing a story from her day. Slowly, the children looked up, their threads pulsing faintly. The father hesitated, then put his phone down, joining the conversation. The threads brightened, weaving back into the tapestry. They fixed it, Ryan said, relief washing over him. They began to, the figure said. Connection is not a single act but a continuous choice. The threads require care to remain strong. As Ryan absorbed the lessons of the tapestry, he noticed something unsettling, a massive, dark section in the distance. The threads there were barely visible, consumed by an oppressive shadow that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent rhythm. What is that? Ryan asked, pointing toward the darkness. That is where disconnection reigns, the figure said. It is the result of unchecked fear, hatred, and apathy. It is what happens when the threads are abandoned. Ryan felt a chill as he stared into the void. He could see faint shapes moving within it, souls trapped in their own isolation. Their threads were still there, but they were so dim they seemed on the verge of disappearing entirely. Can they be saved? Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Yes, the figure said, but it requires others to reach for them, to offer light where they have none. The web is strongest when it is woven together. Ryan's gaze lingered on the dark section. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a longing to reach out and pull those souls back into the light. I want to help, he said. I don't want to just watch, I want to make a difference. The figure's form shimmered, its light growing stronger. You already are, it said. But your journey is not yet complete. There is more to see. The tapestry began to shift, its threads weaving and unweaving as the bridge beneath Ryan's feet dissolved. He felt himself being lifted, the patterns of light and shadow fading into the distance. You are beginning to understand, the figure said, but the choices that shape the tapestry are not made here. They are made in the world you know. Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. Then show me what I need to see next. The golden glow faded, leaving only anticipation as Ryan prepared for the next phase of his journey. The golden glow of the tapestry faded, and Ryan found himself standing in a new realm, vast and echoing, where the air shimmered with potential. Around him stretched a labyrinth of branching paths, each one glowing faintly with its own distinct hue. Some paths pulsed with vibrant light, while others seemed barely alive, their edges blurred by creeping shadows. What is this place? Ryan asked, his voice reverberating in the empty space. These are the paths of free will, the shadowed figure said, appearing beside him. Each one represents a choice. Some have been walked, others remain possibilities. They are not static but fluid, shaped by the decisions of those who walk them. Ryan stared at the endless branching paths, his chest tightening. Every choice? All of these are decisions? Every thought, every action, every intention, the figure replied. The threads you saw earlier weave through these paths, connecting them to one another. Each path you walk affects the tapestry. Ryan stepped onto one of the glowing paths and immediately, the air shimmered. A vision formed around him, showing a young boy standing at a crossroads. In one direction, the boy saw a group of children playing soccer, their laughter echoing in the distance. In the other, a solitary figure sat on a swing, their head bowed. Ryan watched as the boy hesitated, glancing between the two options. After a moment, he turned toward the game, running off to join the others. The solitary figure on the swing remained alone, their thread dimming. What would have happened if he had chosen differently? Ryan asked. The figure gestured, and the scene rewound. This time, the boy approached the swing, smiling as he invited the other child to join the game. The solitary figure's thread brightened instantly, and the ripple effect spread outward. The child joined the group, their laughter adding to the collective joy, and the boy's own thread pulsed more vibrantly. Every choice matters, the figure said, even those that seem small. Each path carries weight. The scene dissolved, and Ryan found himself back in the labyrinth. He moved cautiously to another path, its glow faint but steady. As he stepped onto it, another vision unfolded. This time, he saw an older man standing in a crowded subway station. A homeless woman sat on the ground nearby, her eyes filled with quiet desperation. The man paused, looking down at her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled bill, and handed it to her with a kind smile. The woman's thread, dim and fragile, glowed faintly at his act of kindness. But as Ryan watched, he noticed something remarkable. The man's thread also brightened, sending ripples of light outward. Passers-by who witnessed the interaction seemed affected, their own threads pulsing faintly. The impact isn't just on the one who receives, Ryan said, marveling at the vision. It touches everyone around them. Love and kindness are contagious, the figure said. But so is fear and neglect. Watch. The scene shifted, rewinding to the same moment. This time, the man hesitated, shaking his head as he walked past the woman. Her thread dimmed further, and the surrounding threads remained dull, unaffected by any light. Ryan felt a pang of sadness. It's not just about what we do. It's about what we don't do. Yes, the figure said. Free will is a gift, but it carries responsibility. Every moment is an opportunity to choose light, or to allow the shadows to grow. Ryan moved to another path, this one darker and harder to discern. As he stepped onto it, a vision of a family argument unfolded before him. A father and son stood in a kitchen, their voices raised in anger. The father's thread pulsed erratically, while the son's flickered weakly, barely holding on. The argument escalated until the son stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The father slumped against the counter, his thread dimming as guilt and frustration took hold. What happens now? Ryan asked, his heart aching for both of them. The figure gestured, and the scene played forward. Days passed, and neither the father nor the son reached out to mend the rift. Their threads grew weaker, the distance between them widening until their connection was nearly severed. It doesn't have to end this way, Ryan said, his voice firm. Then see what happens when the choice is different, the figure said. The scene rewound again, returning to the argument. This time, as the son turned to leave, the father called out, his voice softer. Wait, he said. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. The son hesitated, turning back. His thread pulsed faintly, and the father's began to brighten. The two sat down at the table, their conversation still tense but honest. As they spoke, their connection strengthened, the shadows retreating. It's never too late to choose differently, the figure said. But the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Ryan stepped off the path, his mind racing with what he had seen. He turned to the figure, his voice filled with urgency. If every choice matters so much, how do we make the right ones? How do we know we're not feeding the shadows? You don't always know, the figure said, but the heart is a guide. Love, compassion, and humility will always lead you toward the light. Fear, anger, and indifference will pull you into shadow. Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we have to try. We have to keep choosing light, even when it's hard. Yes, the figure said. But understand this, free will is not about perfection. It is about intention. The path forward is never fixed. Every moment is a chance to realign. The labyrinth began to dissolve, the glowing paths fading into the distance. Ryan felt the weight of what he had seen pressing on his chest, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was empowering. He understood now that his life was not a series of disconnected events, but a tapestry of choices that shaped the world around him. As the figure turned to him, its form shimmering with light, Ryan asked, "What happens next?" "There is more to see," the figure said. "But you are beginning to understand. The power of free will is not in knowing every answer. It is in choosing love, even when the path is unclear." The air shimmered, and Ryan felt himself being pulled toward the next part of his journey. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was ready to face it with open eyes and an open heart. The shimmering labyrinth of paths faded, replaced by an expanse that was both vast and oppressive. Ryan found himself standing in what felt like an endless void. The ground beneath his feet was cold and smooth, reflecting his image back at him. Above, the sky was a swirling mass of shadows and faint, flickering lights. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. "What is this place?" Ryan asked, his voice echoing unnaturally. "This is the shadow of consequences," the figure replied, its presence more solid now, the flickers of light in its form growing stronger. "It is the realm where the effects of choices, both made and unmade, are revealed." Ryan's heart pounded as he noticed faint images swirling within the shadows above. They moved slowly at first, but as he focused, the images grew clearer, forming scenes of human lives, moments of joy, pain, triumph, and failure. The scenes were chaotic, overlapping and interweaving like threads in a tapestry, yet each one carried an unmistakable weight. "What am I supposed to see here?" Ryan asked, turning to the figure. "The consequences of choices," the figure said. "Not as isolated moments, but as ripples that extend far beyond what is immediately visible." "Look closely." The ground beneath Ryan's feet shimmered, and he was suddenly standing in a crowded school hallway. He saw a younger version of himself walking quickly, his head down, a backpack slung over his shoulder. Behind him, a group of students taunted another boy, their cruel laughter echoing through the corridor. Ryan paused, glancing back briefly, before continuing on his way without saying a word. "This is you," the figure said. "And this is one of your moments of inaction." Ryan's stomach churned as he watched the scene unfold. The boy being bullied looked around desperately, his eyes pleading for someone to step in. No one did. His thread, barely visible, dimmed further as the taunts continued. "I didn't think I could make a difference," Ryan said quietly. "I didn't want to make it worse." "Your silence was a choice," the figure said. "And every choice carries weight." The scene shifted, fast-forwarding to a few weeks later. The same boy sat alone in the cafeteria, his head down. The golden thread connected to him was faint, almost imperceptible. Ryan watched as the boy hesitated before getting up and leaving the cafeteria, his shoulders slumped. "What happened to him?" Ryan asked, his voice thick with guilt. "He became more isolated," the figure said. "Your choice was not the sole cause, but it contributed. Every voice, every action, has the power to strengthen or weaken the threads around it." The ground shimmered again, and Ryan found himself in a different scene. This time, he was watching a young woman sitting in a hospital waiting room. She was scrolling through her phone, her expression distant and weary. Ryan noticed a faint, golden thread connecting her to a man sitting a few seats away, but the connection was weak, frayed by silence. "What's happening here?" Ryan asked. "She is waiting for news about her mother," the figure said. "The man sitting nearby is her co-worker. He knows her situation, but he chooses not to speak, believing his words would be inadequate." The scene froze, and Ryan saw the man's thread flicker, its light dimming as his silence fed the shadows between them. The woman's thread, already weak, grew dimmer as well. "If he had spoken," Ryan said, "even just a word of encouragement, it would have mattered." "Yes," the figure said. "Kindness, however small, can strengthen the most fragile of threads." The shadows above them swirled, and another scene unfolded. Ryan saw a group of people standing in a park, their golden threads interwoven in a radiant pattern. They were organizing a community event, their laughter and camaraderie brightening the threads around them. Ryan noticed a man standing at the edge of the group, his thread dim and disconnected. "Why isn't he part of the light?" Ryan asked. "He feels unworthy," the figure said. "He believes he does not belong." But watch. One of the group members turned, noticing the man standing alone. She smiled, walking over to him and extending a hand. Her thread pulsed brightly, and as the man hesitated before taking her hand, his thread began to glow faintly. She led him into the group, and their collective light grew stronger, weaving new connections. "Sometimes," the figure said, "all it takes is for someone to see another, to reach out." The scenes faded into the shadows, leaving him alone with the figure. "You've shown me so many ways people fail to act," Ryan said, his voice heavy. "But what about when we try and it still isn't enough? What happens when we choose love, but the darkness is too strong?" "No act of love is wasted," the figure said. "Even when the outcome is not as you hope, the light you create ripples outward, touching lives you may never see." The void around them began to shift, and Ryan saw faint sparks of light within the shadows. Each spark was small, barely visible, but they pulsed steadily, resisting the darkness. "These are the moments of love," the figure said. "They may seem insignificant in the face of the shadows, but together, they form a light that cannot be extinguished." Ryan's heart swelled as he looked at the sparks of light, each one a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope remained. He thought of his own life, of the moments he had let pass, the times he had allowed fear to guide him. But he also thought of the times he had tried, offering a kind word, standing up for someone, choosing to connect despite the risk. "What happens now?" Ryan asked, turning to the figure. "How do I make up for the times I failed?" "By choosing differently moving forward," the figure said. "The past is not fixed. Every moment offers the chance to realign, to mend the threads you have weakened." The shadows around them began to recede, replaced by a growing light. Ryan felt a weight lifting from his chest, replaced by a sense of purpose. "You are beginning to understand," the figure said. "The choices you make are not about perfection, they are about intention. Every moment is an opportunity to choose love over fear, light over shadow." Ryan nodded, his resolve solidifying. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it with open eyes and an open heart. As the shadows receded, Ryan found himself in a space unlike any he had seen before. It was vast and radiant, filled with a warmth that seemed to pulse through his very being. The air shimmered with soft golden hues, and faint music echoed in the distance. A melody so pure it felt like it came from within him. Threads of light stretched infinitely in every direction, their glow steady and vibrant. "This," the figure said, stepping beside him, "is the light beyond shadows. It is not a place but a state of understanding, a reflection of what becomes possible when love overcomes fear." Ryan's chest swelled with an overwhelming sense of peace, but it was not the kind that allowed complacency. It was a peace that called him to action, a peace rooted in responsibility. He turned to the figure, his voice steady. "So, what now? What's the next step?" The figure extended its arm, and the threads of light around them began to shift. They formed a great spiral, each thread intertwined with countless others. Within the spiral, Ryan could see faint images, moments from lives that were both familiar and unfamiliar. People smiled, cried, embraced, and struggled, their connections illuminated by threads that pulsed with every decision. "You have seen the shadows," the figure said. "You have seen how fear and neglect weaken the threads, how love and kindness strengthen them. But there is one more truth you must understand." The threads shifted again, and a new vision emerged. Ryan saw a young girl sitting on the steps of a school, her backpack beside her. She clutched a small drawing in her hands, her thread glowing faintly. A group of children walked by, glancing at her before hurrying away, their own threads dimming slightly as they chose not to engage. But then, another child stopped. He sat beside her, asked about the drawing, and offered her a smile. The girl's thread pulsed brightly, and the light spread outward, touching the threads of those around her. "This is what happens when love is chosen," the figure said. "It creates a ripple that moves far beyond the initial act." Ryan watched as the vision played forward. The girl, now an adult, stood before a classroom, encouraging her students with the same kindness she had once received. One of those students later became a doctor, dedicating his life to serving underserved communities. The light continued to spread, illuminating threads far beyond what Ryan could have imagined. "It never stops," Ryan said, his voice filled with awe. "One choice can affect so many." "Yes," the figure said, "but it requires intention. The ripple begins with a single act, but its power depends on the choices that follow." The vision shifted again, showing a different scene. A man sat alone in an office, staring at a photo of his family. His thread was faint, weighed down by the shadows of guilt and regret. Ryan felt his heart ache as he recognized the man from an earlier vision, the one who had ignored the homeless woman in the subway. "What happened to him?" Ryan asked. "He let fear guide his choices," the figure said. "But watch." The man picked up his phone, hesitating before dialing a number. When the call connected, his voice trembled as he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I haven't been there for you, but I want to try. I want to do better." As the call continued, the man's thread began to brighten, its light spreading outward to connect with others. The shadows around him began to recede, replaced by a warmth that grew stronger with every word. "It's never too late," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," the figure said. "Redemption is always within reach, but it requires the courage to act." The spiral of threads began to shift once more, drawing Ryan's attention to a darker section. Here, the threads were tangled and dim, struggling to maintain their connection. He saw a group of people arguing, their voices rising in anger. Each harsh word dimmed their threads further, and the surrounding light grew weaker. "Why are they fighting?" Ryan asked. "They have forgotten their connection," the figure said. "Fear, pride, and resentment have blinded them to the truth." Ryan felt a surge of urgency. Can they be reminded? Can they find their way back to the light? "Yes," the figure said, "but it requires someone to take the first step. Someone to choose love when it is hardest." As Ryan watched, one of the individuals paused, their thread flickering faintly. They took a deep breath and said, "I don't want to fight anymore. I just want us to understand each other." The tension in the group eased, and the threads began to pulse with renewed light. The shadows faded, and the connections strengthened, weaving back into the greater tapestry. Ryan turned to the figure, his chest tight with a mixture of hope and determination. "So it all comes down to choices. Every moment, every action, it all matters." "Yes," the figure said. "The threads of existence are not fixed. They are shaped by your will, your intent, your love. The shadows are powerful, but they cannot withstand the light of a heart aligned with truth." Ryan nodded, his resolve solidifying. He thought of the times he had chosen fear, the moments he had allowed apathy to guide him. He couldn't change the past, but he understood now that the future was unwritten. "What happens if I go back?" Ryan asked. "Can I really make a difference?" "You already are," the figure said. "But your journey is not about grand gestures or monumental changes. It is about the small, consistent choices to see, to act, to love." The light around them began to intensify, and Ryan felt himself being drawn upward, the threads of the spiral weaving around him. The music grew louder, a symphony of hope and connection that resonated deep within his soul. As the figure's form began to fade, its voice echoed softly. "Remember, Ryan, every moment is a chance to choose. Every choice strengthens the light or feeds the shadow. Walk your path with courage, and the threads will guide you." Ryan closed his eyes, the warmth of the light enveloping him. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side, but he was ready to face it, with open eyes, an open heart, and a renewed sense of purpose. When Ryan opened his eyes again, he was back in his hospital bed. His mother sat beside him, clutching his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I'd lost you." Ryan smiled weakly, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm here," he said, his voice soft but steady. "And I've got so much to tell you." The threads were no longer just a vision, they were his reality. And he was determined to weave light into the tapestry of his life, one choice at a time.